I'm Jonathan, this is Krista, and we're here to help you be a better landlord. All right, Krista, today we are tackling one of the great annoyances of being a landlord, which is what to do when your tenant doesn't pay rent.
That is very annoying.
That
very
is very
frustrating.
annoying. Yes, that can really sour a relationship, not to mention a whole rental business. So let's dig into reasons why somebody wouldn't pay rent.
You know, there are many reasons why someone might not be able to pay rent or might elect not to pay rent,
Yeah.
right? So, on the side of the scale where someone is unable to pay rent, it could be that a family member who contributes to rent has gone into the hospital or has lost their job. There's also the possibility that the tenant lives alone and they themselves have gotten sick and are out of work. They could also be someone like a freelancer who has really seasonal work and maybe a big job fell through they didn't, plan for. And on the other end, it could be, although this doesn't happen very often, that someone is electing not to pay rent for whatever reason. And there are, again, several hundreds of reasons why someone might go down that path. It's not very likely that you are going to move in someone who is going to purposely not pay rent, but there are some telltale signs you can see in tenant screening reports.
Absolutely. And I think the way you laid it out was perfect, where it is not always a conscious decision on the renter's part. They're not trying to take advantage of you, hopefully. Most of the time, let's say, they're not trying to take advantage of you. What are some of those telltale signs, though, that you could see when you're doing your screening process?
As you're screening potential tenants, you really want to look at how they are treating other folks lending them money. So if they regularly pay back their debts, they have a healthy credit score, those are great signs that they might be someone who's going to pay you on time and in full. Of course, the inverse is true as well. If they are carrying a lot of debt, if they have a lot of open lines of credit, these are little red flags that you should pay attention to as you are screening potential applicants.
Yeah. This is also why we always recommend doing some landlord reference checks.
Yes.
Try to talk with some of their previous landlords, especially if they just came from a different landlord, to really get their take on, did they pay in full every month on time? Because that's important.
It's very important. Yeah, it's critically important. And unfortunately, you can't always tell. You could have a really great tenant with all the right stuff in their background, and they could lose their job a month into living in your rental.
Yeah.
And that means, you might have to have some challenging conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah, so let's talk through that. If somebody is late on rent for the first time, how should you approach it?
I would say first and foremost, remember that you are trying to work with them to get this rent money. It is not a contentious you versus the tenant situation. So if this is their first time being late on rent, I would recommend going to them preferably in a way that is written for easy documentation purposes. So a text, an email, etc., a TurboTenant message perhaps that says, "Hey, I noticed that you didn't pay rent this month and you're usually on time. What's going on?" And then just let them fill you in. It could be that one of those situations that we mentioned has popped up. They've lost a job, someone is sick, etc. It could be that they just forgot. That sometimes happens too. Although if they enroll in something like autopay, they are not going to forget. You are going to get that payment on time and in full. So once they give you some context about the situation, you can decide on next steps. If they are outside of the grace period in which they're not accruing fees, you can determine whether or not you want to apply those fees based on your local and county laws. Could also be that this is a really unique situation in which you decide to allow them to split up rent payments for a predetermined amount of time, let's say 3 months if someone's in the hospital or something. Just make sure that if you are making any adjustments to your expectations regarding when rent is paid and how much is paid in which installments, you have that all written out in a signed agreement. That is going to be the best way to make sure that you're legally protected. You're also going to want to make sure that you include information on what happens if they don't make those payments.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you've mentioned it a few times of the documentation. Can you kind of go into why is that important to have it in writing?
Documentation is critical for anyone running any kind of business. You want to be able to say, hey, I had this conversation, I set these expectations, we both agreed to it. So thus, if the behavior goes in a direction where they are not paying rent, there are very clear consequences and they understand that from the get-go. That's good practice in and of itself. But let's say this problem continues. You're going to want to have that information on hand and documented so that you can use it in a court proceedings as needed. Hopefully you don't have to, but yeah.
It's possible.
It's always possible.
Yeah, and we wrote a blog on rent receipts. What rent receipts are, they are exactly what they sound like. Where they're required, because they're not required in every state, but I think many of them at this point do require them. They're always a good idea. rent receipts are always a good idea. If you do collect rent payments through TurboTenant, we automatically send rent receipts for both your records and your tenants. So it essentially just says on this date, this amount was paid. That can help a lot, whether you have a non-payment issue or not. I mean, just for tax purposes, for everything else, it's awesome to have documentation.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now let's tackle, what if your tenant repeatedly pays rent late?
That is super frustrating.
Yes.
So if you've already had the conversations with them, you've said, hey, here's what's out there. We need to have these payments in this specific time, and they're still not making moves. Unfortunately, at that point, you are going to have a couple of tough conversations come up. Specifically, you might have to decide that you need to get them out of the property, right? There are a couple different ways to do this. The easiest one is not going to feel great. Check your local laws, but you could offer a cash for keys arrangement if it's permitted in your state and county. Inherently, a cash for keys arrangement allows you to give your tenant money in exchange for giving you back the keys, which means you're inherently paying them to leave. The reason that doesn't feel great is because when someone owes you money, the last thing you want to do is give them money, right? It doesn't feel very intuitive. But the reason that we recommend it is because it's often a faster solution to regaining control of your property, and that's truly the end game. So while it might sting a little to hand over a couple $100s to someone who owes you money, it's going to sting a lot less than the eviction process, which usually costs $3,000 to $4,000 on average, according to Good Life Property Management, and that is not including the lost rent that you have not been paid.
Right. And then, of course, the eviction proceedings can go on for a very long time.
Yes, and the courts are still backed up from the eviction moratoriums via COVID's heyday.
Yeah.
So, you could be looking at anywhere from a month to quite a few months. And that is all time that you are not getting paid rent. You do not have control of the property, so you're falling farther into the hole.
Yep. Yeah, so with cash for keys, we like to say, look at how much rent you are not receiving if it does go on for, let's say, 90 days. On top of that, the headache, the annoyance, the amount of complaining you're going to subject your spouse to while you're going through this mess. So
Yes.
cash for keys often is an easy way out.
Yes.
It might, like you said, feel bad to say, you owe me money, here's some more money, but then you're done.
Then you're done. And if it's not allowed in your state or otherwise your tenant says no,
Yeah.
that's really unfortunate. You might have to move into the eviction process.
Yes, so how do we move into that eviction process if it comes to that?
If it comes to that, one, just know it is a very traumatic experience all the way around. It's costly, it's exhausting. So really try and use it only as a last resort. But if you hit that last resort, you need to regain control of your property. First and foremost, as always, check your local laws. Your local laws are going to dictate what kind of notice you need to give to your tenants and also the period of time in which they have to act on that notice. So typically it's going to be something like a notice to cure or quit, which says, hey, these are the behaviors you need to fix. Namely, not paying rent. Here's the amount that you owe me. I need you to pay me by this date. Otherwise, you will be expected to move out by this date. You give that to the tenant. Typically, you need to either send it by certified mail, post it on their door, etc. Again, this will all be outlined in your local laws. And that kicks off the eviction process. If you'd like to learn more about the eviction process, we have a whole video on our page. Please go check it out. We'll go into further detail there. But again, it's a long process, so hopefully it doesn't come to that.
Yeah, hopefully not. And how can landlords use TurboTenant to help it never get to the eviction process?
Sure. So starting from the jump, we enable you to screen tenants and feel really confident about who's moving in, and that's for free on the landlord side of things. Your tenant will pay the application fee. You'll be able to have a high-level overview of their credit score, their open lines of credit, so much other information that can help you understand who this person is in terms of how they treat their debts. That information will help you select the best possible tenant who's going to move in, treat your property with respect, and pay you on time and in full. Then when you are working with TurboTenant, you are collecting rent through us. As you mentioned, we will send rent receipts on your behalf. That keeps you compliant if you're in a state where that's legally required. We will also make sure to remind your tenant that rent is coming up to be due so that they can make those payments. We make it super easy as well by enabling auto pay. So your tenant can set up their information once, and then we will automatically withdraw rent for them so that they don't have to sweat it and you get rent on time. And finally, if it does come down where you're needing to look at your tracking documents and see, this is when they made rent, they missed this rent payment, they missed this rent payment, etc., for a court case, you can pull those records directly from TurboTenant and you have time-stamped receipts of everything that's going on, which can be really helpful. Anytime you can automate the documentation process is really a win for landlords.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks for chatting about what to do when a tenant doesn't pay rent. If you out there have any stories of your own tenant who didn't pay rent, leave them in the comments below.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.